So my first story is about the science of pollution, and this will touch a bit on the framework issue that you mentioned earlier as well. And so the background of this is that in the year 2019, several large German cities will face driving bans for diesel and gasoline cars because of air pollution issues. And environmental nonprofit has successfully sued some of the local governments to enforce some air pollution standards that they are in violation of. And this will mean that older diesel and gasoline cars will not be able to drive in cities like Berlin and Hamburg and Cologne. And so the issue with this is that now in the public discussion, for the first time, I think, it is being discussed that the science behind these safety thresholds for air pollutants like nitrous oxides and particulate matter are actually not really based on sound science. So for example, they will give a threshold of something like 40 micrograms per cubic meter of nitrous oxides near like a German Autobahn or a city street. And so that is then supposed to be a threshold of safety where if you go above it, you are harming public health. And so increasingly experts are coming out to say, that's not actually true. So we have established this the threshold of safety by some policy regulation, but it's not really clear that anyone ever gets harmed by these concentrations of air pollutants. And so there's one expert in particular that I want to quote here, and he's a medical professor in Germany named Dieter Köhler, and he has been a former president of the German Respiratory Society. So this is not a fringe view of someone with no credentials. And he puts it like this regarding nitrous oxides. If inhalation of 40 micrograms per cubic meter of air was actually harmful, smokers would die within a few months. So in terms of framework, what he does here is he puts things into perspective. So other activities like, burning a candle or using natural gas for cooking or in this case, smoking, exposes us to much higher concentrations of air pollutants, and that doesn't actually kill anyone. So it's highly questionable that the established thresholds for safety would harm anyone from the traffic emissions. And one of the reasons is that these thresholds are not actually established by any kind of laboratory testing, exposing humans to some pollutants until some of them die, which would be unethical. But they are sort of established by correlational studies. And what that means is that epidemiologists find some kind of statistical correlation or some connection between some areas having higher pollutants and having a certain health impact outcome, like an increased cancer rate or increased asthma rates and so on. And then they infer from that on a mass scale that, a certain amount of additional nitrous oxide or particulate matter or whatever the air pollutant in question is, then would harm people. So like a microgram more of that in the air as a concentration would actually harm a lot of people if like millions of people would get exposed to that. Then they infer some damage on a large scale. Just to give another concrete example, so the German Environmental Ministry just last year estimated that 6,000 people would actually die annually from these nitrous oxides concentrations from air emissions. But we know that...
So I remember, just to jump in, I remember you pointed out to me years ago the different cases whereby using these kinds of correlations, there's just an incredible potential for misrepresentation. And somebody could say, oh, well, Kentucky has a lot of coal burning and a lot of asthma. But then you look at, oh, wait, Vermont has the most asthma of anyone, and where's their coal burning? Or I remember when I was testifying in, I think it was an EPA hearing last year in San Francisco, and I pointed out that Nancy Pelosi had these claims about, oh, asthma is on the rise, therefore we need to crack down on emissions. And yet emissions had decreased drastically while asthma was rising. So if cracking down on emissions correlated with them increasing, why would cracking down on them more lead to less asthma? Wouldn't it, quote unquote, logically, if you're just using that kind of correlation, wouldn't it lead to more asthma? There's another there's another thing that has that's relevant to this in terms of just how one's assumptions about nature and this idea of the fragile nurturer. One aspect of that viewpoint is this view that nature is perfectly clean and also perfectly clean is perfectly healthy. And there's an increasing recognition that this is total BS in the realm of, say, exposure to dirt, and the idea that it's good for the immune system to be exposed to a certain amount of dirt and a certain amount of threats because it develops a certain level of resilience that otherwise wouldn't be developed if you lived in a clean room all the time. And if you lived in a clean room all the time, there would be huge issues to your health. And there are extensions of this to air. And one thing that's just a historical fact is that we evolved in an era of fire. So why is it that our bodies are supposedly perfectly adapted to zero intake of any kind of emissions? And one guy I found impressive, and Steffen, I think you've also found impressive on this, is a guy named Robert Phelan, whom I hope I meet soon. He teaches, or he's at least historically at the University of California at Irvine, so he's very nearby. But if you search his name, Robert Phelan, Phalen, he had a talk on emissions. Maybe we should link to it. But it was about 40 minutes, and he had the feel of he really passed different framework tests that I have. I was really initially impressed by him. I can't totally vouch for him because I haven't read or seen that much, but he seemed impressive.
Yeah, that's true. He's actually a toxicologist, so he has something to say about the actual impact of things like that.
Yeah, he also has a background. There's another interesting guy whom I have met a little bit and should talk to more, a guy named James Enstrom out of UCLA. And one interesting thing about these guys, besides the fact that they're controversial and outspoken in this field, is that they both come from physics backgrounds. So they start as physicists, and then they enter these fields that are very dominated by epidemiologists. I think Enstrom is an epidemiologist, but he comes from a physics background. And some of their criticisms of the way epidemiology is used or abused seems informed by that. I generally have a bias, quote unquote, for people in physics who go into other fields, although that is not any kind of certainty.